This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. It is, I have something going on here that I need to stop.
Rachel.
Otherwise, I'll listen to myself over and over. Welcome. Good to have you all here. We dive much more deeply into the budget this day.
I got muted down here.
Unmuted?
No, you're muted there.
Yeah.
Are you muted in Zoom?
I don't know what I'm doing.
We're not getting any more echo,
Yeah, I think you got it.
so it's good.
Yeah, I turned my sound off on the machine. Okay. We're diving deeply into the budget, and I turn it over to Administrator Zelms.
All right, thank you, Acting President Wall, council members, Mayor Norton, members of the public. Before we get started, I did just want to give a big thank you to our finance team. It takes a lot of folks to get all of this together to this final point to be presenting. So Rachel Hodak, Jason Roloff, Nolan Shield, who is still helping us with some of this, but also parking manager, wears his yellow vest at meetings to remind us that he's parking manager, not working on the budget anymore, but we still kept him working on the budget. All of our department heads also have worked very diligently with their budget teammates to bring something forward, as well as I rely pretty heavily on Aaron Parrish during this time frame as well. So thanks to all of them for bringing forward their ideas, working with us since February to get to the point of bringing you the detail on the recommended operating budget for 2024-2025. Obviously, one of the key things that we really do look at are the City Council's strategic priorities all the way up through the community vision. That is a part of the 20-year plan that was created by the community. We do rely on a lot of teammates in order to deliver on these things on a day-to-day basis. And so you'll see throughout this presentation that there's a significant amount of personnel costs related to this, as well as contractual services where it makes more sense to contract for something.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Allison, the screens aren't working?
Not there.
Oh, they are.
I don't think we're gonna have screens today.
We may not have, we are actively finalizing the overturn of all of our IT. So if you wanted to come to the crowd and look at the presentation, that might work. Or if there is an opportunity, we also then could pass a mic if we needed to. Apologies, I didn't know the screens were not working. Hopefully my fancy voice will help you to see what is occurring. So again, the budget building blocks, really looking at the key goals and the strategic priorities of the City Council. These are pretty high level. So market rate and affordable owner occupied housing, economic vibrancy, resident experience, visitor experience, talent attraction, looking at public realm and projects in that space, and having teammates and maintenance to be able to deliver on that, as well as developing a transition plan for post-2030 power supply needs. That's primarily in the Rochester Public Utilities budget. Oh, mine's not working. So it's also really important to think, as I mentioned, that our teammates started working on this in February. So we have a pretty large budget, a lot of moving parts. We don't just have teammates that are looking at increasing their budget. They look at their entire baseline, they look at how they can deliver service, and they bring things forward. Sometimes those are decision packages to help to augment services. Sometimes that might be reorganization. All of that gets reflected in the budget that comes forward to you. You're at that August, September bottom left-hand bullet, if you can see your screen. And then over towards the middle, the first significant action on the budget would happen on September 18th. That is when we would expect the City Council to adopt a preliminary levy, after which the levy can stay the same or go down. It cannot increase after that point in time. And then you have your, if there's additional study sessions necessary, we would have time between September and December to do that. So something to be keeping in mind today. Are there any questions or feedback on the 2024 recommended operating budget? We do have additional study sessions and time for study sessions that aren't on the calendar built in. If there's any feedback on the recommended budget, feedback would mean, do you think that something isn't necessary to sustain as a core service? Is there a different service level that you think would be acceptable to the community? That is an impact when we start looking at cutting the budget. There are impacts to being able to sustain core services and the levels of service that people have come to expect. Are we investing properly in strategic growth when we're looking at decision packages and how we've built those out? And is that overall recommended preliminary tax levy, which isn't the whole budget, but is something that we talk about considerably, is that appropriate? Are you comfortable with where it's sitting for September 18th, even knowing that you could adjust it further between September 18th and December, so long as it was downward? So getting into the city administrator recommended 2024-2025 operating budget, I did want to just set the stage for how the team is thinking about this. The budget happens over a long period of time, and then we deliver on the budget. But our teammates are always thinking about how can we provide responses in a way that is the most reasonable? What are the tools that we have available to mitigate the cost and still provide optimal service levels for the community? So I won't spend a lot of time on these. We do have teammates that could answer questions if you have them, but we've talked about this to a degree as the team has come forward. So thinking about how we dispatch our police and fire services has a significant impact on how many people you need in order to deliver that service. But we have to invest in that in order to make sure that we are deploying our resources as appropriately as possible, rather than getting a call and sending what we have. And we use the word algorithm, but realistically, what that means is we figure out based on how the calls are answered, what type of equipment needs to go. And so that means that we have more available readiness for other calls for service if we're not going to less emergent calls that could be handled differently or for a longer, people could wait a longer period of time. So continuing to look at how we dispatch our fire service is important and has been important. But for this, you already would have seen a higher levy amount. You may have already been built the next station. It's also what drove a decision package that's in your budget. So considering also light rescue vehicles, retiring those from the fleet, how do we operate? What are the resources that are being distributed and what is provided in order to go to a call for service? Also proximity dispatching. So if you already have a vehicle that's out on a call, they don't come all the way back to the station, they might get prioritized to go to another call. So it actually allows the team to provide excellent service, but in a way where they're using existing tools or new tools instead of new people in order to be able to do their job. So again, that doesn't cut the budget, but it mitigates the slope of increase over time. Significant other things that are happening, looking at temporary versus full-time positions, considering how we utilize partnerships for resources and don't just do that all in the city of Rochester. Sometimes we're the host of that, but we also are the recipient of the value and we don't pay for the entire cost. So many different things happening in the fire department, as well as thinking about how we do things. This was a question that came up. We're always thinking about what is the best way to deliver. Is it an in-house person? Is it a part-time person? Is it contractual? Or is it something that we start with one option and we build towards something else as we see the value? Police is another really good example. They have help with their slides. So that was good job to the police department. They put everything onto one slide, but again, they're sharing resources. They don't purchase one for one just for the city of Rochester. We're able to share some of those resources with Olmsted County. There is shared resource where, for example, this summer we were able to utilize the school resource officers that are mostly funded by the schools to deploy for city time in the downtown and not have to hire new. That doesn't mean that that will be successful forever. It may be that we do that for a time and then we need to do more investment in that space. There's also a lot of grants that they rely on that otherwise would be locally funded. And I think a key here is those community outreach specialists. You hear a lot about the crisis calls for service going up significantly. And this partnership with the county is helping to deploy different resources rather than needing to employ additional police officers. Again, eventually we will need to do that. But we're trying to optimize the service and not just add one for one each time there's a need. Community enrichment, library, in this budget, we're recommending a space study that is shared between the fund balance that they have and new expense. But as we heard when we were at the library, there's lot of interest in making sure that the existing space is utilized well rather than considering significant additional space. And so what something like this could do is to really look at what do we already have? How could we improve some of our services, access points in the existing footprint? Rather than thinking about adding floors, et cetera. There are different ways that you could utilize the existing resource and address some of those accessibility issues and space for employees versus the community. Thinking about parks and forestry, so they have reorganized throughout the year to try to utilize their existing staffing better to address some of the standards in the urban forest master plan and get to people more quickly. Civic Music, this is a real long look back for Civic Music. They have had 4 teammates for decades to be able to deliver on the same services that they do. They used to provide Thursdays Downtown. Now that's Rochester Downtown Association. So there's a lot of different ways that we constantly are looking at how we provide these things. But we know the community really appreciates those services. Their budget primarily focuses on access this year and a different number of shows in order to meet the current budget. So they have had astronomically increasing costs for some of the services that they provide. And so rather than ask for more in that space, they've adjusted their schedule. Again, high performance government. So in this budget, there is 311 or customer service. So rather than calling an emergency line, being able to have sort of coordinated services to be able to answer questions, software to be able to deploy to folks to see where do we have trends? Do we have people calling every day for a certain type of service? And that could help to guide future decisions, but you'd be investing in a customer service center rather than investing in maintenance people or folks out in the field who have to then answer the call and go to the service. So being strategic about how we resource these things so that if there's growth in call volume, we're focused in that area rather than adding more and more people across the city to both answer phones and be out doing service in the community. And we've never had 24/7 on call or weekend IT help for a city the size of Rochester. This budget also tries to invest in that, not just by adding things, but centralizing all of our existing IT resources in order to be able to deliver on that. Some significant health and wellness program to hope to prevent some of the post-traumatic stress diagnoses that result in long-term disability and health insurance costs through age 65 for folks who are eligible for that. Another example of restructuring that changes the FTE count and constrains cost is the Civic Center arrangement. So we do see increases there, but so there's a decrease in the number of FTEs. It's contracted out. It feels like a city service. We're providing lodging tax for that, but it's not something that the city is on the hook for all of the employees, et cetera. We have a fixed dollar amount that goes to the Civic Center for that contractual obligation. A few more of these. Then we have some examples from development services and Rochester Public Utilities. So we have a significant investment in public works. And right now we have kind of borrowed an operator back and forth between the striping and signing crew and the snow crew, and we'll still do that. But this one position actually helps both of those operations year round because they'll be sharing one person each back and forth with each other instead of half of a person each year and each getting sort of a quarter. The community development move to electronic plan review, again, sort of a one-time investment that has long-term value to be able to really reduce the time that it takes for residential plan review and commercial plan review and be able to allow the private investment to happen more quickly in the community. Looking at 2019, the Destination Medical Center program, we actually used to contract the project manager positions out. We brought those in-house. That was actually a savings. You didn't save any significant tax levy because we don't utilize the tax levy for Destination Medical Center. It provides additional capacity within the organization, and it's something that we looked at. It's a higher level of service for less cost. Looking at the budget at Rochester Public Utilities, they have the automated metering infrastructure investment that they're looking at so that they can actually reduce the cost of service over time. Again, that probably won't reduce rates, but it allows them to invest the current rates differently across the system for Rochester Public Utilities, both electric and water. And then also they are always looking at whether or not it's necessary to contract for services or transition So they've had 5 converted positions since 2019 in customer service, marketing, accounting, and IT, because they've looked at it, and at a certain point, it makes more sense once they started with a contractual position to actually bring that in-house, but not when they started the position. So all of that hopefully ends up to what you see here, which is at the very top of the slide, you can see that the actual tax rate has been fairly constrained around 49.4% up to the highest point of 52.7% in 2019. And then from there, it started to come back down again. And in the 2023 budget, the actual tax rate came down since 2019, about 6%. So we are, with the value of property increasing and constraining how much the tax levy goes up, influencing in a positive way the tax rate. However, at some point, there is only so much we can do to maintain the current service levels. And like, you can't just keep bringing the rate down as the city continues to grow and services are necessary for new people that live here and new investment that occurs from the private sector. So this is a slide from April. These are very old numbers in the world of property tax levy, but we won't get the new numbers until after August 25th from Olmsted County Assessor's Office. So what this shows is an estimated increase in the property valuation growth. So not the tax levy, but how much value is across the city, which is billions of dollars of property value. And that is expected to grow about 6%. That was in April again. So this doesn't tell us which category is growing. It doesn't tell us how much the existing base appreciation went up in residential versus apartment versus commercial versus industrial. It's a very raw number, but it also does show significant new construction. If you think of that as proportionality, about a third of that being new construction, that is what absorbs the tax levy first. So as there are increases, the very first place that absorbs that is the new value, and then it is proportionately spread across the rest of the value. And the most significant driver of changes to the property tax bill is the assessment. So if your assessed value goes up more than the average of your class of property, even if we had a flat levy, you would be absorbing more of that. Something a little bit positive, I don't know, it depends on if you're selling your house right now probably, is that we, for the first time in many years, actually saw a little bit of a leveling off and drop to some of the increases in the median sales price year to date for homes. So perhaps that we'll see that leveling off. That will mean hopefully there are new investments and new construction that happen to be able to absorb some of the levy. We also have very low unemployment in Rochester, which influences our labor market, and the city is not immune to that, nor are we immune to inflation. So you've been seeing that for a couple of budgets. Thank you for your patience. So just a few of those things are local government aid. I always have to include this for the lovers of local government aid. It did increase, but because it's such a volatile formula for us, we always every year are likely to be going down in the amount of aid, because the word aid and local government aid is really critical to understand in the formula. Cities that are seeing increasing value in property or had significant changes since the 80s when some of these formulas were created or before are basically need less aid from the state based on how the formula works. So we've dedicated that to capital improvement plans to have less volatility in your tax levy. We were successful at some state bonding, so you'll see some of that in the trend because there are some matches required in order to deliver the projects. Inflation and labor cost adjustments, as I mentioned, personnel costs. We still have to keep up with service. Vehicle and equipment revolving fund. Vehicles also don't just stay the same price for cities. So that's been a fun one to work through in delivering the recommended budget, and will take time to address. Facility maintenance and investment. You do have the deferred maintenance account now, so that's something you can rely on so that it's not competing as much with the capital improvement investments for streets and et cetera. Obviously, some of those things could be influenced depending on the outcome of the local sales tax. But again, these require shifts in amounts and how we are funding the budget in order to provide stability and ongoing service for the community. One of those things is a recommended tax levy of $101.5 million. And we'll talk a little bit about the major influencers and areas of service that are reliant on the tax levy in order to be delivered. Essentially, those are things that we don't charge a fee for. And the levy is how we absorb those costs. And then that levy is proportionate to a total budget inclusive of Rochester Public Utilities initial budget, which is $575.4 million. So it's not a huge percentage of the total revenue that the city relies on, but it is something that shows up in people's mailboxes directly. So these are a few things that show up in people's mailboxes. All funds here combined, you can see some of the comparisons year over year. Operations continue to increase to a degree. That's the 24/7 sometimes operation of the city. There are any number of these services that happen every hour of the day and not between 8 o'clock and 5 o'clock and not on Monday through Friday. The total budget you can see at the top, actually additional increases there in 2025, but you can see some of the changes there in debt service. So we have debt service schedule. Sometimes debt falls off. Sometimes new debt will come on. We try to keep that pretty steady. However, when it makes sense to finance a project, we tend to do that, especially significant infrastructure that's going to hopefully be around 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And then the capital improvement program is where you see the most adjustment. Sometimes we'll deliver a $20 million project one year, and the next year that same type of project is $2 million. So that's in every city where the most changes happen, just like in your house. If you have to get a roof that year, you spend a lot more on your house that year than you're probably going to spend in the next 10 years. So all of that adds up to year over year about a 9.4% increase in the total tax levy. That is not the tax rate, as I mentioned. That is really just what $8.758 million means different than last year. It's just a percentage from math. So the sewer also is a rate-based system. We would anticipate about a 1% change in their rate. That's from their rate study that they did and was adopted in 2021 for the 5 years out 2022 through 2027. Also some connection fees, so some fixed costs are expected to increase a little bit. The electric utility, looking at an increase in both the electric and water rates, the equivalent of about $4 a month for electric and $1.65 a month for water in 2024, similar amounts in 2025. And then I just did want to point out that they're doing their 3-year cost of service study, and that's how they make sure that they're delivering their rates in a way that are compliant with the charter and with some of their charges as a public utility. So I mentioned that the tax levy isn't the largest part of the budget. In fact, the largest part of the budget is actually charges for service. So some of those rates that I mentioned that are really dependent on how much water, electric, and sewer you consume by each category. And then the next largest area is miscellaneous revenue. So that's a lot of different types of revenue that come in small portions that all add up to about 20% of our budget. The green piece of the pie at 17.65% is taxes and ad valorem fees that are related to taxes. So special assessments, things of that nature, and then intergovernmental revenue. So about 15.4% of this budget is reliant on revenue from other federal state resources. So things like transit, they're not hitting the tax levy. Those are coming through federal and state grants to be able to provide that. So people thought transit service maybe be a little bit less, maybe pay a little bit less tax levy. Nope, you just get less money from federal and state government and you have less transit services and the same or similar tax levy. So that's kind of how all of that adds up. And I won't try to go through the very small slices of the pie because they're just not a very large part of the budget. We talked about this last time, but essentially the baseline budget, which is sort of what we get submitted to be the city that we are, and continuing to provide the same levels of service is about 6.9% of the total levy. So again, these are the levy funded pieces of the budget. And then the decision packages, which we really did try to focus still on deferred maintenance, service enhancements, focusing on how we provide a more equitable government, organizational sustainability. Some of those health programs that I mentioned is about 2.53% of that 9.44 total levy adjustment. We did make our way through the outside agency community funding requests, and I do have a slide on that for you, being able to address some of the requests that came in and thinking about those over time. Just another way of looking at it, the vast majority of this budget is existing services and providing that within the framework of the economy that we're in. From a labor perspective is the largest portion of that. So levy supported employee service cost increases that are for existing labor units is about 5.4%. Again, that's not just salary, that's the total compensation for employees, which includes pension, insurance, and workers' compensation. And of course, we also still have this holistic budget stability funding support that's continuing to decline. That was one-time funding to help to push off some of the adjustments that would have been necessary to return from the frozen positions, et cetera, that were used to reduce the cost of the budget in 2021 and achieve a zero levy in that year. And that's about $1 million difference, which tells you 1% is about $940,000 of your budget, levy funded budget. And a lot of that goes to the general fund. So the total general fund expenses are $9.2 million more. That's more than the entire increase of the tax levy. So that tells you there's other things going into this area, like building permits. We're up on building permits. We still try to be realistic about what those will be. But some of the general government and other are funded with those other funds other than the levy. But public safety, very labor intensive, as is public works, is a very significant part of what we do here. And we don't charge people when we answer the 911 call with a fire truck or a police response. So this dollar bill changes generally proportionately with the size of the dollar bill year over year. The general fund, which I just mentioned, out of that whole $575 million budget is about 68.5% of that. Of the tax, that was not true. Of the $101 million tax levy, the general fund is about 68.5% of that. So it makes sense that some of our largest services that are 24/7 are costing more and that the tax levy would need to be absorbing that. We go around Parks and Recreation. The capital improvement program doesn't change much year over year. We dedicate a very similar amount of levy there. It's about 8.4%. We got to change that again. Debt service and internal services are that small gray bar there at about 4%. I skipped over the library. Library and Parks and Recreation are a very similar amount of property tax distribution. And that's kind of where that sits. The airport's a very small amount. We're really just funding utilities there. And the way that contract works, any revenue over expense comes back into a capital account, and that's what's used to match those major investments that happen from state and federal grants. So another way of looking at this is how reliant is each of these on the tax levy. You look at the left blue bar, that is the total expenditures. And if you look at the right yellow bar, the amount of tax levy outside of grants or other like dispatch is located in police. So there's different sources of funding there as we partner with the county, some other sources of revenue that come in, but they're very reliant on the tax levy in order to deliver those services. And so those are the most significant areas where you would have an impact on the levy if you were going to change your level of service and impact the tax levy, which typically we have a pretty high expectation for service in the city of Rochester. Another way of looking at that, just to remind folks, DMC capital projects are not reliant on the tax levy. We do have some internal service funds, the capital improvement fund, and these all add up to 100% of the tax levy. The airport, again, they have a small amount there. Debt service that is funded by the tax levy. And then the general fund is one of the larger portions of the fund reliance. So it relies on 60% of it could be delivered with the tax levy. So 40% of that is not relying on tax levy. So there's just not a lot left there to be able to address when so much is coming from there. Municipal recreation does have some fees for service from rental charges, other factors and partnerships. And then the library is pretty reliant on the tax levy, both the city tax levy, and then there's also a countywide library levy that comes since not just city residents use it. I'd like to give you a little prediction of the future. And so you saw a little bit lower percentages here in the past. We actually adjusted some of the costs here. There's a whole giant system that builds behind this chart. But essentially looking at some of those commodities and inflationary impacts that we're seeing and trying to build a better picture of what we think might happen so that you can predict, okay, if these are things that if this type of levy isn't something that you can support, then we need to have some real critical conversations about where you're okay having changes in level of service. and a robust process to let the community know what that might mean. I would just point out that in 2026, that assumes that there would be some significant financing of the municipal recreation facility for maintenance. There, as we had mentioned before, there are some decisions to be made there, so that may not need to be quite that high, but we wanted to give you a clear picture of if you did finance the whole project, what that would look like. So again, another way of looking at this are what are some of the drivers. These would be higher through 2026, but for some of the use of that holistic budget stability funds, the major impacts there in 24 and 25, but in 26, there's still about $250,000. The projected amounts do reflect annual contingency items. So there were a lot of decision packages that didn't end up in the recommended budget. Those were all real needs, real ideas, real value to the community that will likely be coming before you or a future council in order to continue to maintain services. But we have some other things I think that are a little bit more important before we move through with some of those significant investments. They're millions of dollars of investment, and it's not reasonable to bring you something that is that much larger than what we've provided you. It also assumes that regular personnel cost at 5.5%. Again, that's not cost of living, that's the total package of cost. So that those cost of livings, there's also steps in some of the labor contracts. There is health insurance, workers' compensation that we have to set aside for overtime in the cases where we have to have a certain level of service overnight and on the weekends. And then we also see some reductions in the debt service costs as you go out into the future. Again, that 2026 reflects some maintenance facility costs. Again, one more way of looking at this. So these are the major revenues that the budget relies on to roll up to that $575 million. So you can see where the charges for services really show up is in Rochester Public Utilities. Not surprising since we're the largest municipal electric utility in the state of Minnesota. But again, the sewer utility charge, stormwater utility fee, et cetera, also show up here. And some positives, we're seeing increases in a lot of these, not just tax levy. So those are mitigating factors for the budget. Good time to explain how this chart works. This is per capita by FTE. So oftentimes we talk about how many FTEs we have per capita. This is a different way of looking at it. So each FTE is basically supporting on average since 2015 about 130 people. You can start seeing that declines a little bit. There were some positions added in the middle of this time frame. But then we had frozen positions and some other things occurring in 2021 and beyond. So we started to creep back up, back to the 2016 levels of service there, which isn't surprising that we have employees that are feeling a lot of pressure and concern and that we're seeing significant turnover in those time frames as well. This was an eye opener. I will look behind me and see if it opened any eyes back there. So this is 42 years. This was a long time. Some of us have been around for about that amount of time. And you can see the population is that far left light blue bar. So about 111% increase in the population in that 42 years, but almost doubled in size. Significant increases in the acreage of parks, significant increases in electric distribution lines, water mains. So as the city is growing, whether that's infill or growth, but there was a lot of growth during this time, bringing in different parts of the city. The area of square miles tells you that, 208%. There's a lot of infrastructure that gets added that has to be maintained, that needs to have service, that needs to have coverage, that needs to have that same level of service for significantly more to support. Number of parks went up significantly, as well as the good old fire hydrant. Lots of people touch those from different services. The little tiny green bar is the number of full-time equivalent positions that have gone up. So you can see, like, we've been trying to do as much as we can to be able to mitigate the cost of service to live in the city of Rochester, but still have a very high quality of life. So we do that through partnerships. We do that through sometimes contractual services, and sometimes we'll go from contractual services to in-house and vice versa, but that really depends on the needs of the day or the needs that we're projecting over the next 5 to 10 years. But there has been a lot of cost mitigation that has gone on over the last 40 years to try to be able to be a great city at as little cost as possible. There's a lot listed here. These are decision packages. Some of these are $15,000 decision packages, and some of these are $300,000 decision packages. I think this is a good opportunity to share that these are all of them. These are not all levy funded decision packages. This is every decision package that came forward. So a good example of that might be the, goodness, maybe it's not a good example. Oh, very on the far right-hand side at the bottom, Link Rapid Transit Staffing. So that's anticipated all, just like the rest of transit, to be funded by, it's an enterprise fund, so it's paid for by its rates and cost of service. It doesn't rely on the levy. Organizational health and wellness, that's for everyone, but that's trying to mitigate the cost and keep our police and fire officers well, to try to mitigate the number that might qualify for post-traumatic stress, because we don't want them to feel that way. We don't want to lose people to that, but there are long tails on that as well. So many of these are things that make sense to pay for now because they will mitigate a cost in the future and push out cost in the future as well. There's not that many positions in here, but you can find these in the flipping book. I sent out the flipping book link to you. So every single one of the recommended decision packages, as well as additional decision packages, are listed there. So you can see the ones that were recommended to be included now and the ones that we would expect to see again in the future, but that weren't recommended yet. Also, to your budget, 2025 recommended decision packages. Again, these are not all tax levy funded, but a number of them are. You can see here that by 2025, you would be getting to step 2 of 8 of the fire plan that you had seen. And there is some capacity in here for 2025. There are some things that you might need to make decisions on in 2025 that we cannot wait till 2026 for. There are a lot of changes that happened at the legislature this last session. So I think we just need to be prepared that the actual implications of those are still not yet to be fully known. There could be positive impacts to that, but there could be costly impacts to that as well that we just need to be prepared for, but not, I didn't want to bring sort of knee-jerk decisions to you without full information either. So all of these, recommended and not recommended, add up to 120 pages of your budget book. So it's a little bit difficult to get to the 9.4%. And this is part of why, because employee services is a significant part of a budget for a public service agency like the City of Rochester. You can see the top 5. These are changes from 2023 to 2024, and none of these should stand out as if you're a short line, you're good, and if you're a long line, you're bad. If you're a short line, you either have less employee services or a smaller budget, so a percentage increase for you is less. And if you're a longer line, you may have had significant demographic changes in your employee base, or we needed to absorb, for example, in police and fire, some costs for the ongoing costs of health insurance for those who went out on post-traumatic stress, which is really unfortunate because we also had higher replacements for these folks. We're seeing a little bit of a good problem to have in the police department. You had a lot of turnover in the last 3 to 4 years in the police department. So some of what you're seeing there is we had some newer folks coming in, which reduced your budget, but they're saying that's a good problem to have, that they're hitting some steps and they're hitting some costs. And so in order to be able to retain a workforce, it's costing a bit more. And you'll recall that's an over $30 million budget. So proportionately, it should be a larger increase in personnel services. So in a normal year, the year-over-year cost would be less, but we do need to pay the costs that we owe per for folks' long-term disability arrangements. So fire is primarily employee services costs year over year, but we don't have that labor contract closed yet. So just something to note there. We try to project, but if this goes all the way to arbitration, we don't always know what the arbitrator will do. Community development, building safety, that is primarily adding back the last frozen position. And then some year-over-year increase. We obviously have increases in building permits, so we want to be able to get those through and have those properly inspected without too much wait time. That costs a lot of money to the private sector when they have to wait for inspections. And then Public Works has 2 new positions, and the rest of that is year-over-year. Almost all of the rest of that is year-over-year increases in employee services there. But it's also oftentimes a 24/7 operation. You can't plow the streets without human beings. Maybe one day, but not today. So all of that adds up to a significant impact to the levy. So these are all levy-funded areas of the city. And the CBD maintenance it's a levy-funded area, but it doesn't impact your overall levy to the property tax. It actually offsets costs that would be picked up by Parks and Recreation. So there you go, adding up to $9.6 million of increase for all funds, including RPU, is the expense for personnel. General fund picks up about 5.8 million of that. Library and municipal recreation are smaller. They rely a lot on temps, but it's very hard to get a temp these days. So we've had to significantly increase the pay in those areas. And then other funds that are not levy funded are about 3.2 million. The increase, and as I mentioned, salaries are not the entire cost of personnel. The increase in salaries is about 7.3%. We have market adjustments, we have the COLA, we have steps that we absorb. Employees are absorbing a little bit more of their health costs. But we have 19 bargaining units and we are very heavily regulated by Minnesota personnel requirements. So those are things that we have to go through. There's wage grids that get set and those all roll up into some significant costs to the budget. Whether that's levy funded or not. Health and dental has actually a pretty reasonable rate trend as compared to a lot of different areas. We are self-funded for that. Our favorite, community reinvestment funding and economic development. So these typically we would refer to as outside agencies. As I had mentioned, the actual requests were pretty significant. Some of those were things that likely won't happen unless the sales tax is approved because they would just be such significant increases unless we had more time to talk about it and plan for how that might be absorbed in the tax levy. But you can see that there are some increases in each of these areas. No longer funding the Diversity Council, which dissolved. However, there was community building funds that came forward as an idea from our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Director and Communication and Engagement Director. And this would be able to fund some mini grants, event grants, and community building focused programming. So those wouldn't be ongoing costs. They would be to help much smaller agencies, which was one of the goals of the Diversity Council. But we could do that in-house. Pretty interesting ideas that came forward from Olmsted County History Center and some of their long-term investment plans to be more focused on the cultural history of the community and cultural diversity, welcoming and inclusion. This would help get them started with some of the grant funds that they've received and allow us more decision-making in 2025. 125 Live, we now have a contractual obligation, a small adjustment there based on that contract. You can see the Rochester Arts Center getting close to back to where they were before the pandemic. And then looking at, well, you actually can't see it on here, but if you did, you would see that they were higher than $178,000 pre-pandemic. And then Rochester Civic Theater is the largest recommended increase there. And that's really related to some success that they've been seeing. That number that is 100,000 used to be a $200,000 number. They've really changed their model. They're overflowing with folks, but they also have costs that they're experiencing with their personnel and being able to keep people and serve all of the other entities that utilize the Rochester Civic Theater on a regular basis. So all of that rolls up to not a huge increase in the budget, but we tend to talk about this one a lot. So I thought we'd just throw it in there for you for food for thought as we move forward with other study sessions. That does come out of the general fund, so just something to point out. And this just shows you all of the expenditure category changes, including RPU from the current 2023 budget through 2025. So not huge changes here. You can see that actually the capital improvement plan comes down a bit, but again, that vacillates depending on when we're doing very large projects. And some of those you'll see coming up are things that the utility will build up funds for in order to be able to smooth their rates. Contractual services, you can see some increase in 2024, come back down a little bit in 2025. But generally, the largest change there is in that debt service category, as we've taken on some investment, primarily for the accelerated investment in parks facilities. So that is paid for by park referendum. Where does the money come from in the whole budget? This is the slide I tried to tell you during the levy slide. Tax levy is a large percentage of the general fund revenue, 114.5 million. Or excuse me, the general fund revenue is $114.5 million. Tax levy is the most significant part of that. This is a different way of looking at that dollar bill. Other taxes, miscellaneous revenue, but the general fund is very reliant on the tax levy in order to be able to provide the services like police, fire, and public works that's provided there. This is an important one. You saw some of this in the audit I guess that was also in July when we went through the audit. We are a bit over the 42%, which is the lowest that it can be. So I'm not suggesting that you just get to 42% as an arbitrary number. We also have a lot of unknowns coming, as I mentioned, but there could be some room here to have conversation about even how we address the park maintenance facility, et cetera. But this is the state auditor recommendation, no less than 5 months or 42% of the budget. We carry a lot of costs through the first half of the year. We get a lot of payments in January, and then we get like not a lot of payments until July. But we spend a lot of money between January and July. Oftentimes that's in payroll. So if you were to see this on like a monthly basis, I knew it would happen eventually. On a monthly basis, you would start seeing it go down, 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 then revenue comes in. And so we need to have a lot of cash available in order to sustain ourselves based on how revenue comes in. Again, we're seeing a return in the lodging tax, a little bit of a different strategy here than in the past. So as the lodging tax returns, the recommendation is to really think of that as the operating and capital for the Mayo Civic Center and Sports Commission. So there is a recommended increased funding in 2024 and 2025 for the Mayo Civic Center, huge increases in labor and supply and commodities happening in that space, just like we talked about with civic music. But also there are any number of civic uses there that really can't increase the rate that they pay. A good example is significant use by Minnesota high school sports. Significant increases in the cost for security, but not significant increases in the rates that they pay to utilize that. Also takes a lot of down days in order to set the floor up, take it down, et cetera. So what we're showing here is anticipated increase in occupancy. That's far left column, or second to the left column. Average daily rate, so how much someone is paying for a hotel night. The number of rooms in the market, actually you see a decrease in 2023. I wonder what that could be. Student housing. And then showing some additional increases in out years based on things that we know would likely be happening in the community. Again, we have a 7% hotel tax rate, but 3% of that is committed to the debt service on the expansion that occurred at the Mayo Civic Center and can't be used for anything else. And then the remainder of that is going to be able to support some of the operation. So into the operating budget, we're expecting to see these increases, but we're not relying on all of that for operating, much like the local government aid. I think the most important thing to see here is the additional city contribution. So if we actually reach those goals, we would be able to see additional contributions to the capital maintenance fund for the Civic Center to be able to be self-sustaining. If we saw increases beyond this year over year, that's also something that would be a good policy discussion for the elected body to have about other facilities that are intended to be focused on hospitality, like a sports center. Special revenue funds, are we ready to keep going? Okay, we're almost there. Well, we're getting closer. Special revenue funds. So something important to think about a special revenue fund. Once the money goes there, it's restricted. So you can think of these also as restricted revenue funds, unlike the general fund. The general fund, you could move money from there to go anywhere else, but not true in a special revenue fund. Well, not all the money, I guess. If there's a grant, you can't just use it for whatever you want. So what we've predicted here in the 2023 and 2024 is an increase year over year. A fair amount of that you noted was for salaries, but also there are some decision packages here. So we're anticipating some additional aquatics. For folks that aren't aware, the Soldiers Field aquatics are underway, and there is the Silver Lake Master Plan that anticipates some sort of aquatics there. And If that's able to be taken through final design, there will be likely construction happening in some additional aquatics, whether that's significant splash pad and wading pool or something larger, remains to be seen, but we want to properly support that. Again, the accelerated investment from the implementation of the park levy. So there's operational adjustments necessary for some of those. Challenging increase in the cost of part-time staffing, and the city wage grid need to be changed. So you can see, they'll see that coming up for the library as well. And then it includes the funding. So the cost side is here for 2 additional full-time equivalencies to do downtown maintenance, but that would be funded by the Central Business District funds. So it's not a one-for-one levy issue, but we do need to evaluate whether we would want to do contract operations and think about how we maintain the entire downtown with parking ramps, skyways, sidewalks, nighttime, daytime, trees, et cetera, and how we can do that to optimize investment. Also, the library is a special revenue fund. So once funds are assigned there, if they don't spend it all, it stays in the special revenue fund. So there, it has its own fund balance. That's where some of the cost for the space study would happen. Again, higher part-time staffing costs based on that wage grid, contractual costs for some technology and software continuing to rise, and the cost of materials is increasing significantly while the collection's use is higher than it's ever been. So we're trying to constrain that as much as possible, but still provide a high level of service. Airport, I had mentioned on the other slide. So the main difference here is in capital. There's a small increase in the operating levy to support utilities. But again, all of this is the revenue exceeds the expenses, which is what we hope for. Typically, we get a check back to the city, and I think this year was $1 million to the capital maintenance fund to be able to match the state and federal funds for most of the work that we do at the airport, but also for city owner required improvements. There are improvements at the airport that the FAA will not pay for and have to be completely locally funded. Transit, another special revenue fund, primarily because all of this is really getting funded by state and federal government. So it needs to support a type of service that is public and meets all of the requirements of that funding. Again, if we didn't have this, you wouldn't have $14 million available for other uses. You just wouldn't have transit. Enterprise funds are different than special revenue funds, but they are intended to operate more like a business. So their costs of service are built into rates that are intended to pay for the cost of providing the service. So parking is reliant on itself, and occasionally for capital projects and one-time funding. It also will utilize its retained earnings in order to reinvest in itself. So the rate study is in progress. You approved that a couple of meetings ago. That doesn't mean we're looking to increase rates. It means we need to understand how parking ramps are getting used and the entire parking system to understand how we get people back in. And there might be a scenario where you could get more revenue if you had a different structure in how your parking worked. Second Street ramp, ongoing evaluation. We constantly are reinvesting in these facilities. Ramp 6 debt service, we continue to carry. And then a technology upgrade that is trying to make them more friendly to folks. Wastewater, also an enterprise fund, relies heavily on rates in order to pay for itself. Again, we've got that significant upgrade coming, multiple millions of dollars. The debt schedule is layered in order to be able to absorb that when it comes. And the rate study anticipates it not needing to have wild vacillations in rate in order to accomplish it. So we're saving annually so that we can reinvest without having a significant increase. But they also have commodities that have gone up considerably. So they're absorbing that within their budget, but also in how they provide service. Stormwater, also an enterprise fund. We're completing phase 2 of the comprehensive surface water management plan. And then we would be implementing that, meaning capital projects in 2024. We anticipate some increasing costs based on the infrastructure needs and not anticipating completing that rate study until we see what the outcome is for the local sales taxes. That would have a significant impact here. I will attempt to talk through the Rochester Public Utilities. As you can see, it's a pretty large part of your budget, anticipated to be about $215 million in 2024. But it's also a very huge operation. It doesn't even just serve inside the city limits of Rochester. So their rates are really based on a strategy that focuses on providing service at the board policy and the home rule charter, being reasonable, compensatory, and uniform within the class. So each class of customer should not see wild vacillations from someone else within their class. Reducing cross subsidies with rate classes. So we don't want commercial to overburden itself for the costs that should be residential and vice versa. And making sure that those fixed costs for things that are fixed costs of service, like you can't get electric if you don't have a transmission line, are more fixed, and how much you use would influence what your variable costs are. So the actual rate on your bill for the number of therms that you use. And then, or I guess it's not therms, that would be gas. Anyway, how much electricity you use. The cross subsidies, again, we try not to have cross subsidies. We try to have each area pay for what its cost of service is. And then, of course, they always try to keep their bond rating high. They did just get reaffirmed at their AA2, I believe is what they are. Which also keeps down the cost for any financing there. That's actually a very high rating for an electric utility because that's a revenue bond rating. So here's a different way of looking at it. The water utility is not nearly as big as the total cost of Rochester Public Utilities. So the water utility is about $17 million in 2024. Again, it relies on a rate increase plus a fixed charge, so that $1.32 per customer in order to deploy the automated metering. Which does have cost savings over time, which means that you can reinvest that to be able to provide more at that same rate. Cost impact to the average residential customer for that is anticipated to be about $1.65 a month. Again, they're anticipating customer growth and increases in consumption there. So if we sell more water, then you get more revenue just because of how much water is being used. And there is some private contribution when they construct for private uses. Private pays for private. The payment in lieu is important. That is something that does come back into the general fund in order to offset the cost. It is an in payment in lieu of tax. So it helps to mitigate the tax levy. So increase there is anticipated. And again, they look at their budget more like a pro forma and a bottom line. So as a utility, they're looking at their change in net position. They're looking at how much debt they have, and they're looking at the net change in cash. This is something that we do, but typically in the budgetary basis, we're looking at it as a year-over-year budget, and they're looking at it more, what does this mean for the bottom line as they rely on retained earnings much more in order to provide operations, and of course, their revenue-based service that can fluctuate based on use. And then the electric utility, the lion's share, which is about $88 million in 2024. Again, anticipated rate increase, you can see there, and on average, they would expect a customer to pay about $4.12 more per month. So that's an average customer. If someone's a heavy user of electric, they're going to pay more. If someone is much more green in their operation, they would likely pay less. Again, they're assuming customer growth and additional consumption, so more usage in order to be able to bring more revenue in. And they also are anticipating more private funds. As they do projects, they are very strategic about making sure that they serve their private customer. You might imagine what the largest private customer is, but they do pay for their entire cost of in a construction project. And then you can see here, they are anticipating some incremental full-time equivalents coming in and some conversions of contractual in order to be able to meet the needs of the automated metering system. And that infrastructure is a significant capital project that they're looking at. Looking also here at an increase in the payment in lieu of taxes there of about 1.1 million. So again, mitigating the tax levy. We may have some room there, but we want to have a more final budget from RPU before we anticipate that room. And then investment earnings increases is obviously they're in the electric market. So that's part of why they have such a large budget. They are carrying a lot of ins and outs from if they bet well on their electric and we actually produce some electricity. So sometimes when there's very high usage, they're actually reducing their costs or making money. But again, increased labor and benefits, almost $2 million there at the electric utility. Again, another way of looking at this is the change in net position. So they're anticipating utilizing some of their fund balance or retained earnings in order to deliver projects, not unusual at all in a utility. You can see they're still anticipating that they will have a pretty significant fund balance at the ending, actually increasing their fund balance. And I think it's just important to point out, we did get some one-time funding for public safety in this last legislative session that we don't anticipate receiving until 2024, but we want to make a good recommendation. So we're still talking that through with police chief and fire chief. One thing that I think we've landed on to a degree, although we don't have a final number, is looking at maybe a phase 1 and phase 2 recommendation to deploy some things in the near term and then focus on what would phase 2 look like in order to be able to assure we understand the impacts and understand even, for example, what the winter looks like for some call volumes, et cetera. And hopefully to be able to do an evaluation that would help really inform you knowing like this is what it's going to look like to be able to properly support public safety, which is the largest part of your general fund budget going forward, recognizing that there's going to be needs. There already are needs, there's going to be needs, and we need to prioritize those appropriately and understand what the impacts might be in order to be able to continue to maintain a high level of service. Look, we made it. This is the slide you saw at the beginning, which means we're at the end. So again, the next stop for this is next week. And so the intent here is to sort of set the table for $575 million of spending, have a better understanding of what that all rolls up into, hear what your questions and concerns are, understand how we might be able to provide some focused, more detailed information in any area for you next week when you have your next budget study session. And also understand if we need to build some additional study sessions into your study session calendar. So with that, reminder of the policy considerations, and I won't leave it on the thank you slide, but we'll say thank you and go back.
Thank you. I'm sure that Chief Kirska will appreciate the analogy that that's like taking a drink from a fire hose. A lot of information. Questions from council members?
Yeah, I'll try to start out. So I look at the budgets through at this, the way you set it up there earlier, it's that sources and uses of funds. And I really appreciate the focus on levy because that's a most important one for us now as we go through September, setting the max levy. Some different areas here. I want to go to page 26 and make sure I understand some different things there. This is early on where it's an overview page. Let's get it, bring it up on the screen. We spend a fair amount of time focusing on that operations and also the focus of the general fund. And also we're going to spend more time, I think, next week on CIP, but I want to better understand what's happening with the changes in front of us on our debt service, that we seem to be going from 2023 to 2024 and going down a little bit, like we're retiring some debt. And then we seem to be going up, which I think I understand to be district energy, but I'm hoping to get a better understanding.
Is this the slide or do you need?
I said page 26.
Page 26,
Did I say?
I think is slide 28.
Yeah, I'm looking off of the online version and it's the one that's 2024, it's the overview of the budget, the
Slide
575.
23.
Okay, sorry. That one?
That's
Oh.
it. It's 26 on my charts, but let's go from there. Yeah, I wanted
Page
to
Page
understand.
26.
number and a slide number. So now
Okay.
knowing they're off by 3 is helpful. Thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. I was looking at page numbers. Yeah. I just wanted to understand debt service going, if I'm reading it correctly, it drops a little bit year over year and then goes up. So I'm assuming there's something retired and then I believe it's district energy coming in. Is that a fair way to think of it?
I believe it's a combination of district energy and also some of the accelerated investment from the levy. But maybe my team of finance folks can help me phone a friend.
That's correct.
Okay, they said that is correct. So yes, there, I mean, we do try to ladder it, but sometimes the debt doesn't come in like exactly when the ladder starts to fall off and pick up.
Do we have any feel for it ratio here that on a $575 million budget, having this much debt is really on the lower end?
This
It's
is
in,
on the way lower end.
that's what I would think. And I just want to make sure I understand that. I mean, I appreciate the fact that we're not using up our budget and our levy dollars paying debt, but at the same time, I would think this is on the lower end.
I guess I could give a comparison from a place I used to work in Minnesota, and their budget is considerably smaller, and their annual debt service is anticipated to be about $10 million a year.
Okay. And
Yeah, Your Honor, and maybe just the other thing too, and this is the combined budget, right? And so a fairly significant portion of that debt within there, I'm trying to see the numbers, but it's like 27 million out to 25, is RPU as well. So I mean, I think the vast majority of our debt profile really is that enterprise fund supported debt or special revenue fund supported debt. Our general fund supported debt is fairly de minimis at this point. So the only thing we have on the books at the moment
thesis.
is the DSIC and the original construction of the Public Works and Transit Operations Center. And then the things we're forecasting forward would be the downtown building energy transition and the park maintenance facility.
Yeah, that's helpful. And this is the debt service, what we're going to pay on it. This is not how much debt we're in.
Correct. This is the annualized debt service.
Okay. All right, good. That's helpful to know. And then as far as on the CIP for that same chart, I want to understand when we talk about the capital improvement things, just from a budget perspective, is this the amount we're funding CIP for in 2024 or the amount we're spending on CIP?
This is the amount we're anticipating to spend on the capital improvement program for 2024 and 2025. There could be things that could delay a project. There could be some changes, but generally this is the budget that we're anticipating to spend in those years.
Again, if you just spend a minute with me so I understand this, this is the amount we're going to like spend on a project, but we've been putting aside money for projects. I want to understand when you do it as a total that I'm counting it correctly.
Yeah, I think we would probably need to bring you like some detail that would show how it changes year over year to understand, because it's going to depend on the project. Many of these are things that we built up funds for, especially in the utilities. So especially in the utilities, we use a lot of retained earnings. So anything that showed up on an enterprise fund, anything that showed up there is usually going to be something that we saved a significant amount for, and also that we laddered debt for in order to be able to keep a flat rate.
And I would just add, like, if you think about this in your context, as Allison mentioned earlier, the levy supported portion of the CIP is relatively constant year over year. So of the 201, or again, trying to see the numbers exactly, but of the significant amount there, 8.2 is levy supported CIP, and the vast majority of the others really are project dependent. So if you think a $150 million project like BRT,
right,
that's landing in one of these, over a couple of years, but that's really the kind of variability you see. And so significant federal funding, significant DMC funding, and that's really the variations. And you'll continue to see wide variations year to year, but that levy piece is very constant. It goes up, from like 8.2 to 8.6. It's like usually a 3 or so % progression that you see in that year over year.
Okay, and this probably leads to, but we have been trying to do a little bit more like putting aside money in retained earnings for our asset base. And I think we've done this underneath of this budget out of just setting aside money for future CIP. Is that accurate, or did we not get to do that because of some other constraints this year?
We did. Two places where that's happening. So there's the about $800,000 set aside for the ongoing facility maintenance fund, which isn't like just cleaning floors. It's like significant maintenance to facilities that had never existed before. And so that used to compete with that capital improvement program of the 8.2 million. But also being able to focus some of the lodging tax increase to be able to focus towards the Civic Center. The presentations that you had for that was for all of our facilities. So if we could dedicate lodging tax back towards that, that helps to get you much closer to proper amount of funding with more than one revenue source.
Okay, Thank you. That's
Maybe
helpful.
the only one other item of note in the CIP, this forecasting forward is that, you know, and again, rounding the numbers, we budgeted for the operating budget about $3.9 million in local government aid, which is what we were projecting to receive. You know, we obviously and historically have been much higher. We kind of went a little bit lighter with our LGA slides this year. We did receive more than that, and the additional above and beyond that we received was programmed into the CIP too, because it's not viewed as, you know, long-term that we would likely see that. So we're trying to program it more toward one-time issues.
Okay.
And it's
No.
projected to decrease in the trend of the CIP.
Yeah, one of the reasons I bring it up is I watched the top line number on the budgets, and I have seen that, like you say, the variability year over year. The operation shouldn't have as much variability, but it makes sense that the CIP would. I wasn't sure if we were accounting for it as what we were putting aside in the current year or what we were committing and spending. It sounds like it is the set spending number, which will vary year to
Yeah,
year.
it's the projects that are there.
Okay.
Where that would get set aside would be another sort of retained earnings or fund balance.
Okay. And then the next slide I wanted to talk to, I guess it's a chart, or it's on slide 26. Just a breakdown of the levy increases. Again, just to me, very telling that the levy supported employee services. I mean, what it comes down to is the city is a fairly employee or human services, and we saw that in more detail in some of the detailed charts. But what's really driving this is the cost of people, with the assumption that we're staying at the same service levels.
The vast majority of this, yeah, is that.
Yeah. And then again, I think the key thing then, there are the decision packages driving about 2.5% of it. And
Correct. And
again,
there are some people in there, but it's a handful.
yeah, no, that's a good point but there, I guess what I'm trying to get towards is when you get down to this 9.4%, and if we're supporting it, what are we really supporting? It's that ongoing plus these other things that we're deciding to increase service levels or make changes to. So I want to kind of call it out as important to me. And again, same thing with the people cost. I think it's on my page 40. Let me find it and then I'll read it off. Yeah, it's your slide 39. Again, this is the important thing, that if you're going to have an issue with this budget, it's going to be focused on these 5 top areas spending. What are we going to do on police expenses? What are we going to do on fire expenses? What are we going to do on public works? I want to make that clear, because there's so many of these other things that we talk about that are the enterprise funds. I think the city staff gets used to this, but people hearing this, it is harder to reel it out. What we really have in front of us is, are we going to continue to spend similar on our snow removal, on our public safety, on our projects, on our plan to change how we're doing some of our fire services? Are we going to continue to do that, or do we want to pull back? And I'm trying to portray it that way. Do you think I have the right perspective?
You absolutely have the right perspective. If the main concern that we hear about is the tax levy, we need to be focusing on things that are tax levy funded. So if, for example, if the community doesn't like a certain service we provide, if it's not funded by the tax levy, it will have no impact on their tax bill.
Yep. Okay. And then the other one, again, I'm very focused on the levy, but from a fees, I guess I want to point out, and this is both for my peers, but anyone watching, I want to be careful that we kind of said RPU's got these, and you hear numbers like 3 and 3.5, but there is some significant changes there. When you're going from December to January on RPU bills, there is a major new investment going on with automated metering, and it is something that it is not going to pay for itself in the early phases. And this is something, as a utility, we're going to have to recover those costs. City Administrator Zelms, I think you mentioned $1.40 and then something else, but added together on an RPU bill, you're probably looking at just being an RPU customer is probably going to go up at least $4 before your service fees start going up next year. RPU is stepping up and trying to do the RPU Connect. They'll try to do good communication on this. But again, from watching the levy, but this is also fees, and you can see in our budget, levy is only 20% of our city funding. This is a significant one that I hope people realize and isn't a surprise come January. So I think you understand it the same way.
Yes, and I mean, to clarify, that the savings in a city budget is generally like it will over time be a much more effective operation to have that automated metering. But again, you have to deploy the capital project and then you have to support the new level of service. But that should be a mitigating factor of operation like into the future, long-term. So mitigating does not mean reducing. It just means that it's slowing the curve over time.
Okay, good. That was my concern. As far as going back to the questions, again, I think I've had my questions answered. I agree that I'm going through this more than some of my peers, and it's still difficult to absorb it all. But going back, and I can support the 9.4 with the idea, again, that my other options are dealing with our public safety and our public work stuff at levels I'm not willing to do at this point. I guess I'd like to see continued focus on those decision packages in that 2.5% where we might have some variability. And I also appreciate the fact that I'm probably seeing a third of the decision package that came forward.
And you can see all of them if you go to the giant flipping book, which is online.
Been there.
Mr. Palmer.
Oh, thank you.
Just Before we transition
go ahead.
back to Councilmember Keene's question, just to provide additional point of clarity, we have a crack team of finance staff back there that gave us some additional information. So that debt escalation in 25, that represents a balloon payment on some sales tax related debt that we had. We have the cash for that. So it's not really levy specific or impacted, but there's about a $10 million balloon for debt issuance that we did with the 2012 sales tax.
Aaron, can you go closer to the mic when you next time? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you. I mean, we do have a AAA bond rating, which I don't think anybody else in the state has as a city, which is
There are other cities that haven't been none for as long as the city of Rochester.
we've had it for over 50 years,
Yes.
which means we're fiscally trying to be responsible. If we decide, we don't like a tax levy of $8.7 million, if I read it right, $950,000 is about 1% of our tax levy.
Correct.
So if I came up with $950,000 for the cuts, then that would be our 1%. Now, I'm not saying we're going to do that, but that's an example of somebody says, geez, I paid too much, then come up with $950,000 worth of cuts.
And that's about the increase in fire personnel.
And that's about a 7.3% increase as I read it. An example of, for me is with Public Works. When I asked, how much does it cost to plow the snow? It's about $30 per person per year, which I think is a pretty good bargain. I know I don't want to go out and shovel for that price, but we could. The other thing, and I'm not saying that we're going to do this, but if you took $8.7 million, if you closed the library, that would almost take that up. Not that we're going to close the library, I just want to be clear, but that's an example, simple example of how much things cost us. And I don't think anybody in Rochester wants to close the library. So that $8.7 million is that kind of an example. I'm a little hesitant on the RPU stuff, and I'm not the person on the RPU board. Mr. Keene is. I'm not sure this metering is the right decision to make, or the investment, or where we get our bang for the buck on it. I am worried that in 2030 we lose SEMPA. Are we prepared for that? Where are we at with that and the cost of doing that? The other one is plant removal. We have the Silver Lake plant, which I'm not sure if we are bonded or we have enough cash to tear it down, or why don't we tear it down? I'm not sure where we're at with that. And I'm not sure where we are with the agreement with Mayo Clinic on the steam when that runs out. I do like your investment on the outside agencies. I know when we sat there, that's an investment for increasing. They are having a hard time with salaries, but they also, with a little bit more money, can do better for us. I do like to point out, and I saw that on there, that transit gets $0 for property tax, in either does the DMC capital project. So, we cut them if you want to, but you don't save anything on property tax. Am I correct on that?
You're correct. You actually, depending on the project, might have to do it anyway and pay for it with your capital improvement plan dollars that are dedicated elsewhere now.
Okay. Well, I enjoy looking at the budget and reading everything that we've read over the weekend, and it's always fun to read. And I think we're doing a pretty good job on it. So thank you.
Mayor Norton.
Thank you. I don't know that I would say it was fun, Councilmember Palmer, but it's interesting to look over the budget. I just want to really, nail down some of the comments that were made about our staffing. And when I looked at this initially, and you and I have been over this too, particularly the chart that shows the percent of change of operating indicators from 1980 to 2022. And you see, population has had a 111% increase. Our number of FTEs is 17%. we have run an extremely lean operation, and I actually have concerns, and I'm not suggesting that we want to blow up, but we're a growing community with growing needs, and we have limited staff, and they're working their tails off. And at some point, we have to acknowledge that we're going to need to add staff in order to do the growth and development that we're doing in this community. And this may not be the year to do that, but we can't keep pretending like we're not growing, because we are, and we have data and evidence to prove that. And I think to Allison comment Administrator Zelms mentioned, which is this community has very high expectations for what it wants. That includes all the park amenities we have, that includes snow removal, that includes, upkeep, all fire and police. It has very high expectations for the kind of community it wants to live in. And we're doing that without drastic increases in staffing, but to keep the staff we have had settlements in order to keep the staff that we have. And I think we just need to acknowledge that. And I do think the amount of flexibility in this budget of things that can change is pretty tiny. I might have one or two suggestions for things, but they don't make a difference in the overall budget in any way that's going to be significant for the taxpayer. So I watch the administration upstairs lament these changes. They get a little grouchy too, actually, during this budget time, because it's super stressful. And I watch how hard they're working, trying to make ends meet. And, the decision packages, I put my few in this year. They were very small. And as you can see, the mayor's budget is not growing, and neither is the city council's. But it is our major departments, and we have to have those services. So I appreciate all the work that they've done, and just really wanted to call out that it is our staff. And we have wonderful staff in this city. We have to pay them to keep them. And I think we're going to have to look at more staff in the future. This isn't maybe the year, but it's coming.
I'll just point out there is a little bit more staff here in this budget. It probably doesn't change the percentage on that page, just based on the magnitude of years. And maybe it changes it below the period, but it would be sort of like a decimal change. But I did just want to reiterate to the mayor's point, something that I said earlier, and the goal as we continue to improve the budget and do a 2-year budget is to have better predictability out into the trend in the future. And I think, as you saw with like the fire plan, that's not an insignificant cost to your budget over 8 steps. It's pretty significant. But the intent is to provide the best service based on the calls that are coming in and what you can deploy. And having that kind of financial plan across the entire levy funded system would be really valuable. I think it might be a little scary for you, but I think it's also better to know that these things are coming. And I do think it would be valuable to take a look at the decision package section. I could have probably felt comfortable putting all of those in, but I couldn't have felt comfortable coming to you and saying that there aren't other things that we might be able to do to mitigate those or to do them more optimally over time. It's just that they are all likely to be coming to you if you're on the city council for any length of time. There's just, I mean, I'll just use public safety as an example. Like, if that $5 million from the state was ongoing money, that would be great. We could do some great things, but it's one-time money. And so we want to be able to tell you from that, these are some initial investments that we could make. But this is what we think that you're going to need to be able to prepare to do an ideal state and a okay state for public safety in order to meet the type of call volume that's coming in, the expectations from the community. Some of these things are intended to mitigate a bit of that. If we can get people to call 311 more often and have some trends there, I think you would be surprised if you heard what kind of calls for service actually come into the emergency line at the dispatch center. I think people would be surprised. They would be. What people consider to be an emergency. So I mean, again, I just would thank the team for putting what they did forward. It is challenging because none of these were bad ideas. None of these were like, oh, let's just put a Band-Aid, let's just throw some money at it. They were all things that are based on information, but bringing you like a 20% levy adjustment didn't seem fair.
Yeah, and I'll just mention to the council, I mean, one of the things I brought forward, and I didn't do it tongue in cheek because I did mean it seriously, but it was huge, which is a staff member focused on business growth, development, and strength in this community. Most communities our size and larger have full departments. We don't have anyone whose full job is to focus on that. And so I put it in there this year as a talking point so we can start having this discussion, because as we've all worked on the downtown task force, which was post-pandemic, we have a growing community with growing needs, and we can't keep pretending like we're a tiny town with 3 businesses. We have many businesses and many needs, and we need to, as a city, be able to support them. And, I'm pleased that RDA and the chamber and some of those are working really hard to stay on top of it. But as a city, we have a role to play in this too. So I just set it out there for like I said, discussion for this year, but really for future focus that we may need to talk about. I hope we do talk about it.
I can reserve most of my questions. I will ask one, and then Councilmember Dennis has a question. On slide 18, could you help us and the public understand how it is that our tax capacity goes up, thereby the tax rate goes down, while property taxes that arrive in the mail, understandably from the city, the county, and the school, continue to go up year by year?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Wall, and it really depends on who got the property tax bill as to whether it went up, because the major driver of this is really the valuation of property year over year. So if someone's assessed value goes up proportionately more than the rest of their rate class, so let's just use an easy number of 1%. That's not probably ever going to happen, but some cities see decreases in valuation. So if it was 1% and the value of your home went up 1%, you would get the average proportionate amount going to after new construction absorbed the first amount of increase of the tax levy. If your increase was 10% and the average increase in residential value was 1%, you're going to see a significant increase as compared to a property that actually only appreciated in value about that average of the cost of housing. So the major driver here is the assessed valuation and the proportionality of how the property tax spreads. Another example of how that could change is that when certain classes of property change in value, so during the pandemic, commercial started to see reduction in value based on the activity that wasn't happening. And so that spread differently across the piece of pie that's property tax. As we start to see commercial values start to come back, they will start absorbing the first new construction, then a class that grows in proportionality will start absorbing more proportionality of the tax levy, whether it's flat or not. And then within your class, your assessed value will really dictate. So if you're in a hot neighborhood that's selling a lot of housing at a lot more than what you bought your house for, you might be expecting to see increases in your tax levy. And that's primarily driven by the assessed value. Also, as property values overall start to increase beyond that $400,000 range, people start dropping out of the homestead credit. So while even if the tax didn't go up, if your assessed value increased beyond what the homestead tax credit is, that credit to you falls off of your tax bill and you don't receive that credit anymore. So what we've been seeing in some areas is pressure from two sides, but that's the state law for how tax is assessed, and the assessor's office is required to have proportionality within the classes. So,
okay. Councilmember Dennis.
Okay. Thank you. Well, so I would just wanted to point out for people who are at home or not conscious of the time, it's 5 o'clock, and the city session is officially, according to what we have agreed on, is done now. I think this is an incredibly important issue that needs more time. So to answer the questions that are presented to the council, we don't have time to even ask questions, let alone go through those inquiries here. But I just want to touch on a few things because I know there's a bunch of staff here and council that need to go home and get back here in time for the city council meeting at 7 o'clock. The few items I just wanted to point out, I have many more. As Mayor Norton mentioned about the growing community, I feel that we need to invest in our teammates, our city staff. The survey taken was that there is a lot of negative views, and so I think investing more wages, more investment in the city staff would be a very important part of the budget. And according to our, and I hope that we all look at this often, the strategic vision, principles, and priorities. We have a very vibrant and compassionate, innovative team, which I think is wonderful. Compassionate with when we talked about PTSD, help focus on the well-being of people. But innovative, I think we need to focus on that. There are so many amazing, innovative staff members that instead of putting money into consultants that are often very, I believe, overpaid, that I believe the bidding process isn't necessarily as competitive as it should be, putting more emphasis in-house, more wage, more staff, more priority on the teammates, because I feel myself, and I believe my colleagues on council, have an allegiance and a very deep commitment to Rochester, which staff may have more than consultants coming in from the outside. So that's what my thought about that is, to see if we can evaluate how much we spend on consultants and take that money and invest that in staff. So hopefully maybe city teammates could do some of that work with more teammates at a higher wage. And then also a lot of these overviews we hear these are high level overviews. And in order for the council to be part of our job is to oversight, to be the voice of people in our community. I think we need more deep understanding. And I know that we have cut some of the city council budget for training. Many of us came on during a pandemic, and new staff, Allison, City Administrator Zelms, and many staff retired, and different changes. So I think that we need to go many more study sessions, if not just Mondays, but throughout the week, to really understand the budget. And we can't really, sign our name to something, vote for something that we don't understand. And I feel, after talking to past council members, I've spent a lot of time on the phone talking to past council members with incredible wealth of experience. And they said in the past, they were so much more in the books. They would talk to the departments. They went line item by line item, really understood where the budget, at. And I feel that would be more beneficial earlier on, instead of like rushing now where we're over our time frame. All of us have even spoken yet, have had questions answered. And so that I think would be really wonderful, to have each department meet with the council in a study session or small group and say, hey, this is our innovative approach, what we can cut, what we can do without. And instead of doing, I feel, a fear-based approach where we say, oh, we're not going to cut the library. I mean, we're not going to, want to hurt safety, public safety. These things Councilmember Keene mentioned were that's 5 top areas. This, yes, of course we have to focus on those, but all the areas we can shave off, I'm sure, a lot off of little wasteful here and wasteful there, or things we could better more efficiently. And I think we should look at the whole budget, but understand it, because not all of us can be experts. I'm a school teacher. We have different expertises on the council. So I think that would be good for more council sessions as well. And I guess I have a lot more, but just to give, because we're over the time frame, I would like to see to answer these questions presented, not just more, council sessions, but more in-depth looking at the departments and what we can do.
So I would just point out what I shared at the beginning of this, and perhaps, unfortunately, you may not have quite been here yet, but all of these budgets are focused on, at first, the baseline, understanding where is ability to adjust each line item in the baseline. So each department, the experts that deliver services like police and fire, go through their budget, and that's how this budget is formulated. And so we go through processes for months and months with the expert teammates who are trained in order to be able to provide the services. And then they come forward with what their baseline needs are in order to continue to be the city that we are, as well as decision packages that come forward, which allow them to be able to continue to provide capacity. I believe in a number of different instances, they have shared that there really isn't a lot of room in their budget. And if you look at the personnel costs, you would be looking at cutting personnel in order to make any significant impact to the tax levy. So I just think it's important to point that out again, so that the last statement isn't that there's wasteful spending in this budget. I think if any of the department heads came up, or if you talk to them, they would say they have very little discretionary funding in their budget. I also want to point out that the training and travel budgets for all departments that are funded by levy, a bit of an increase in police, are back at the pre-pandemic levels, including the city council. And the number that has been referenced in the past was when the city council and mayor's budget were combined, and those are no longer combined, but the amount that had been spent on council is back at the pre-pandemic 2019 level that was approved by the council at that time. Training is something that the city takes very seriously. Growth and development is something that the city takes very seriously, and the departments also feel like that's very important as part of their overall ability to provide an environment that employees can thrive in. But we do have a study session scheduled for August 28th, a follow-up study session. So if there's specific areas where you think there might be items that could be cut, that would be great for you to bring those forward in order to be able to really focus in more on those areas. I also heard an interest in looking at the Rochester Public Utilities budget a little bit more closely, and we can make sure that we have teammates hear from that, and then a better understanding of what's in some of the decision packages that, especially the decision packages that are levy funded. Those were some of the key things that I took away from the conversation with the entire council. That sound accurate?
Something that may be available to us in a week's time, having communicated with staff through this day, could be what increases might mean to a specific median value house in Rochester. I think that will be a really valuable piece of information for those of us sitting here, and really for all the citizens of Rochester too. So if that were amazingly available on August 25th, perhaps, and certainly by next Monday, that would be great if we could have that information as well.
If we will do our best to provide that by August 28th, and if for some reason we can't, we will provide it as soon as possible, even if we can't provide it in its first format at a public meeting, but also make sure that we do that in a future study session if we don't get that information in time from the county.
So we extended our time.
I just want to point out these questions that Councilmember Wall has. I mean, I appreciate trying to get it down to that simple thing, but it is a fool's errand because there are so many other things that can happen with other values going up and down that we cannot in September tell someone what their change is going to be because the assessor hasn't gotten what we need and then he has to do his work. So we can try to do that, and I think we can be fairly close, but I wouldn't want to get caught up telling someone this is what's going to happen to you because we do not have, not only can we not do the math to get there, we don't have the control of what that would be. And I think Councilmember Zelms or City Administrator Zelms tried to explain that by saying like there's other factors here that come into play.
I think we can do a little bit of both and also be explaining that if someone's value goes up more than the average, that is going to be a different number for them. But we also do have a YouTube video that tries to provide that in a bit longer context for people to see what some of the influences are. And we do have plans to put that out in social media and in a press release so that people can get that information for themselves as well, or you could use it to answer questions of members of the public, but we will try to do as much as we can to provide that even more context about that, including the average value home, recognizing that if your increase of an average value home went up more than the proportionate of the rest, that you may absorb a little bit more of the tax levy.
I have some qualms about calling it a fool's errand. We could use different language.
I'm
Mr.
here
King.
for it.
I tried to do this 3 years ago and I found out that I was on a bad path.
Any other questions about the budget before we turn over to?
Just one, and that is, I know the state has changed their aid for people whose property tax has gone up. If you could present that to us also so that we have that information. Yeah, I think it went from 12% to 5% increase in property tax. So there's some help that the state has for people. So that'd be helpful too.
We can also provide that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move from the budget to future study sessions.
Sure, I'll just, Kelly Ray, excuse me.
Sorry, I'm hiding back here so I can look at the screen. One thing that I would also like to see, honoring how perhaps stressed and overworked staff is with only a 17% increase since 1980. I'm actually curious how much technology has played a part in us not having to increase staffing. So if you could potentially bring us if we were functioning at the same level of, let's say, 1980 and 1990, projected staff levels would be 22% or 56% increase or a 32% increase while accommodating for that, tech, because there's been a significant growth and expansion in the tech industry since, well, I was in high school in 1980. So I'm sure that's played a part in being able to keep staffing levels lower, but 17% increase is, in my opinion, not adequate for the level of services that we have, being the third largest city in the state, the largest user of electrical utilities in the state, and being labeled by the League of Minnesota Cities as a first-class city. So what can we do better for our residents, for our staff, for all services that we provide, taking that into account?
Yep,
Thanks.
we can get some context for that. I don't know if it'll be exactly that, but we can get some context for other things that did grow in the meantime, like some of our contractual services, which isn't all professional services. Some of that is people in dump trucks that are doing road construction. So we can get a little bit more context about that as well.
Thank you. Future study sessions.
Well, your next study session is going to be almost like this study session. And so again, this was intended to set the stage, be able to present the information. The flipping book, which is several hundred, I think 600 plus pages, is available online. I sent that out to you on Friday for some additional context if you would like to wade through it. It is clickable. And then we will also on September 6th be planning to have a conversation about housing stock and the ability to influence some of the cost of residential housing, as well as a follow-up update on the people experiencing homelessness situation and some of the work that our teammates have been doing to be able to come back to you with additional information. We do have some additional study session time reserved out into September, October, November, obviously, to be able to bring any other further questions that might come up next week. But again, we do kind of start with this high level, which was policy of the City Council. The City Council used to start their whole budget process in September as of 2018. So we're well underway. You've had a couple of presentations, and I think we're hopefully into that focusing area to get folks more comfortable with the details of what's in the recommended budget.
Thank you. We are adjourned. We meet again at 7 o'clock.
Well,
Thank